Hey everybody, this is John for MTGO Nexus coming at you with a quick 5-deck list for the best decks in the Modern format at the beginning of April of 2022. As a friendly reminder, if you do like Modern content, especially of the red-based variety, whether it be Burn or is it Murktide, please consider subscribing to the channel. That said, let's get into a little bit of things and the decks that we are going to be talking about. So the first thing to keep in mind is the banning of Lurrus the Dream Den, which happened now several weeks back. Obviously impacting quite a few decks. Decks like Hammer Time, Grixis Death Shadow, all the various, Burn, so many other decks were playing this card because it was kind of ubiquitous. Probably about, I think Wizards quoted like 30 or 35% of the decks that were going 4-1 in leagues were playing Lurrus. So, decent chance the card had to go. Was kind of restricting a little bit of, things, whether, you want to play Liliana of the Veil or, any other 3-drop, 4-drop in your deck, Seasoned Pyromancer, etc. Some people feel it restricted the deck building a little bit, so Lurrus the Dream Den is gone. Let's take a look at the meta. What is the number 5 deck currently to beat in the Modern format? So number 5 deck in the Modern format is a deck that's kind of balanced between 1st and 5th and 6th throughout the coming last several months, and that has been Hammer Time, probably the number 1 combo deck in the format outside of maybe Amulet. This is a deck that tries to pair Colossus Hammer with some type of way to equip it, cheating the equip cost of 8, trying to put it on a creature, whether it be an Inkmoth Nexus for a one-shot kill, or pairing it with things like Shadow Spear to trample over, just putting your opponent on a really fast clock. You also kind of have this grindy game with your Pure Steel Paladins and your Esper Sentinels if your opponent wants to play this reactionary game. And then you can also play cards like Caldera Complete and Reality Chip. Reality Chip's a very interesting card. As long as it's attached, you may play lands and spells from the top of your library. So that adds another dimension to the deck. Obviously, Nettlecyst, Sword of Fire, and Ice Caldera Complete weren't played when Lurrus the Dream Den was mostly in the deck, although there were some decks that were starting to mess with Caldera Complete and Sword of Fire and Ice. So, some of the sword decks, or some of the hammer decks had already started to move away from Lurrus a little bit. It did add another angle of attack for the deck that already has 2 or 3 different angles. That said, the other side of the combo, Sigarda's Aid, Pure Steel Paladin, allows you to attach your hammer. So it's kind of what the deck tries to do. You play a bunch of cheap dudes, try to get a hammer on something, kill your opponent, or you can play this kind of grindy value chipping game. A lot of people, a lot of decks used to be around like Infect, Death and Taxes, and I really think this ended up being the culmination of all those decks kind of shoved together into one very powerful package, and this is truly probably the first mono-white or white-ish deck in the format that's been playable in quite some time, and it's been around for some amount of time, so people are not terribly surprised by it anymore. Sideboard, whether you're playing mono-white or the blue splash or black splash. Black splash generally is for like discard spells. The blue splash allows you to play a little bit of light permission along with some of the hate creatures like Meddling Mage. Also allows you to play Reality Chip in this particular version. Cathar Commando is a new one, but it allows you to destroy artifacts or enchantments without having like disenchants in your deck. So it gives you another body. Blacksmith Skill is one of the cards that popped up in the Lurrus or non-Lurrus builds when Caldera Complete and such will start being a thing. This allows you to kind of, negate removal and give a hexproof for a turn. Mainly gives you a little bit of light permission, maybe against things like Titan and such where you don't want particular spells resolving. And then Meddling Mage allows you to just name whatever particular card you don't want your opponent to play. Manriki Gasari, pretty decent in the mirror match. Relic of Progenitor Destroying type of graveyard nonsense. Especially when you have 4 copies of Urza Saga, which is yet another angle this deck has. So this deck is very versatile, and I don't see it going away anytime soon, despite the banning of Lurrus of the Dream Den. Number 4, this is a deck that has been around for quite some time in different forms, different places. I played this deck all the way back when it was first evolving from the aggressive Death Shadow decks, when Gataxian Probe was banned and you were playing Street Race and Gurmag Anglers. And it kind of evolved in this form where you're playing the much cheaper creatures. When the deck first started popping up after the post bans, people were trying to play Murktide Regent. And I think people have kind of settled on that, while Murktide's a very powerful card, it does stretch the mana base. And Kaito is quite a very powerful planeswalker, doing things that it's trying to do. Beyond that, you still have the Ragavan DRC Death Shadow package, and still in Croxa, you're still playing a bunch of powerful, cheap interaction cards. Mishra's Bauble, the strategy is still the same, although you just don't have that extra oomph in Lurrus the Dream Den to grind against, 4-color control and such. So you are a little bit more vulnerable to those kind of strategies, but Kaito does help in those particular instances. Beyond that, obviously Death Shadow is a core to the deck, trying to reduce your life total either in aggressive or controlled manner in order to have this big 13/13 creature. Dive down allows you to deal with Urza Saga tokens and such. This deck is very flexible in what it's trying to do, has some draw unlocks for permission. As far as the sideboard, you have different options. This particular version is deciding to play Gigantha, along with various different other things. Torok for the grindier matchups. Another dress down for Urza Saga, Spell Pierce when you need a little bit like permission. Kolaghan's Command, kind of filling the role of Lurrus, but not quite. Terminate when you need a little bit more hard removal against like Murktides and such. Then obviously Nihil Spellbomb against any type of graveyard shenanigans. So that is number 4 on the list. And what deck is number 3? Alright, number 3 on the list, Amulet Titan. This is a deck that's been around in some form or iteration for quite a few years. It survived a banning of Summer Bloom, survived the banning of Field of the Dead. So this deck's gone through a number of iterations over the years, and really has kind of become one of the format pillars in place of, things like Burn or Tron and such. It's kind of the big mana deck that tends to perform well. It's a little bit vulnerable when, things like Ether Gust and such are a big part of the format, but overall, very powerful deck that's trying to ramp into Primeval Titan, and then doing a bunch of different things with lands, whether it be things with Urza Saga, whether it be things with Valakut the Molten Pinnacle. It got a new tool recently in Boseiju Who Endures, allowing it to deal with Blood Moon, one of its natural predators. Beyond that, though, you're just kind of ramping with things like Arboreal Growth and Explore, using things like Amulet of Vigor to pair with your bounce lands, get a little bit ahead on mana, and then Dryad and Azusa as kind of your bridge to the late game with Primeval Titan or Cultivator Colossus. Cultivator Colossus, another big recent printing. This allows you basically with a bounce land to just continuously draw cards, get mana, especially if you have an Amulet in play. So this deck gets to be quite particularly powerful, mostly piloted by Fran. He's most known for the deck, although other people have played with the deck. It's probably one of the most complicated decks in the modern format. I would say between it and Death Shadow, its sequencing is the most tricky. The sideboard, you have a lot of different tools for a lot of different matchups. You play different additional bonus lands. Thing like Bojuka Bog deal with graveyards. Thing like Boseiju as a third copy to deal with especially Blood Moon. 2 copies of Engineered Explosives to deal with Small Idiots. Emrakul. Well, you can hardcast it in this deck. This is more of a tool against Mill. 3 copies of Endurance. Also reasonably good against Mill, but pretty much against any type of graveyard or Darcy decks. Force of Vigor gives you a little bit more answers to enchantments, particularly Blood Moon. And then Tireless Tracker gives you a little bit more of a grindy plan against any type of, 4-color control. Is it Death Shadow? Those kind of decks gives you a little bit of a grindier game plan. Then the Fire Spout gives you a little bit of play against the aggressive decks they're trying to go under you. Maybe clear up some Hammer Time tokens after you've dealt with their hammer. Maybe dealing with things like Humans if people are still playing that. Just random sweepers are nice to have against any type of tribal creature decks, although those decks have not been faring particularly well in the modern format for some time. But Amulet Titan, probably the trickiest deck to play in the format, but number 3 currently on our April Power List rankings. Number 2, Murktide Regent, probably the leaner, meaner version of Death Shadow currently. This is a deck that literally took no hit from Lurrus. Very powerful in what it does. It's a Lurrus Darcy, Murktide Regent deck, Modern Horizons 2 tribal deck. It's just trying to play a bunch of cheap spells, counter your opponent's key spells, kind of go from there. You play things like Spell Pierce, Counterspell, and Archmage's Charm to deal with your opponent's key spells. You play Ragavan, Darcy to get on the board early. Murktide Regent's kind of your fast closing creature at the end of the game. And then beyond that, you have things like Unholy Heat and Bolt to deal with Planeswalkers. This deck is very well rounded and has a few weaknesses to a little bit to Graveyard Hate, and can kind of get outground by 4-color control or 4-color blink. Expressive Iteration, obviously one of the most efficient and powerful cantrips in the format. Allows you to see 2 cards mostly on most turns beyond turn 2. And then Mishra's Bauble gives you another free spell to play with your Darcy and also another card for your Murktide Regents. This particular version gets to play 1 copy of Ataru Soaring City. And you're starting to see more and more of these lands from the Kamigawa popping up. as a one of. Boseiju, obviously the most notable, but Ataru is a decent one. Beyond that, sideboard, the deck's main overall weaknesses are fast or aggro and control decks go over the top of it. Otherwise, it has a very nice tempo plan against a lot of decks. So, things like Engineered Explosives and Fury to help deal with creature decks. Relic of Progenitus deal with any type of graveyard shenanigans, as things like Dredge can be a little bit of a problem. Split on Magus of the Moon and Blood Moon in this particular list, which I kind of like because, once again, Boseiju is kind of a thing. Jace the Mind Sculptor, you'll generally see in some numbers in these games. Mystical Disputes and Flusterstorms and Spell Pierces, usually pretty good against other control decks and decent against whatever combo decks that are around. There aren't that many. Basically, you have Belcher, and maybe occasionally you'll see the new version of Neoform, and a couple copies of Dress Down to help you deal with Urza's Saga tokens. Overall, this is my personal favorite deck in the format right now. Normally I'm a Burn mage, but, Burn... People have done well with Burn, but Burn's not particularly well positioned, I don't feel, right now. So this is definitely a very powerful deck that you should at least be aware of and know how to play against if you can possibly manage it. So if this deck is number 2, then what is number 1? Number 1 is Money.deck, or 4-color Blink. This deck comes in a bunch of different varieties. That's the thing, is most of these are 80-card Yorion piles, so you get to play a whole bunch of just stupidly powerful spells. This is kind of the spiritual successor to the old Omnath Uro decks that used to be a dominant force in the format before Uro and Field of the Dead got banned. Basically, you use things like Abundant Growth, Spreading Seas, Wall of Omens, Ice Fang Coatl. You get to tear through your deck at an incredible speed. Cantrip your way, win some more. And then, what you do at the top end, some versions play more counter spells, some versions play more interaction. This version's kind of in the middle, so kind of why I chose it. But most of them, are sporting Run in 6 into Fairy Time Raveler. Most of them are Omnath decks. And then beyond that, you usually have some forms of Solitudes and Furies. You have Prismatic Endings, some we're choosing to play March. Basically, it's a cantrip deck, and then all kind of get tied together by cards like Ephemerate, which allows you to continue to regain value. This is one of those decks that just kind of outgrinds almost every deck in the format if it lives long enough, and the pitch elementals often let them live long enough. And then, about the only deck I've seen that can kind of go over the top of it, Amulet can to a certain degree, Tron can to a certain degree. They're both very powerful decks overall, but this deck is definitely number 1. It definitely has given me fits as a Murktide player at times. You get down, we're exchanging resources. Suddenly they see a Solitude, and you're like, well, I don't counterspell, so they've got a 3-2, and I've got nothing left. Some of these versions also play Expressive Iteration. Like I said, the density of creatures is kind of like one of the big things with this version. We've played a variant of it on the stream that was more of a controlling version, had like more counter spells and stuff. One of the things that holds us back from seeing the numbers that it probably should is the fact this is probably the most expensive deck in Modern, if not the most expensive, one of the most, just because you're playing all of the elementals, you're playing Omnath, you're playing Teferi, you're playing Wrenn and 6. So you're playing all the greatest hits, you're playing an expensive mana base, so that'd be one of the things that holds this deck back. But as far as options, this deck you don't get more options than this deck. Sideboard, as I mentioned, big mana can be a problem, so that's why you're seeing things like Obsidian Charmaw, and then Boseiju gives you another answer to Tron lands. Actually, no, it really doesn't, because it allows them to go get a land. Never mind. Search for that way for a land on the base. You can blow up Tron, but you can't blow up their forests. Aether Gust, pretty good against Amulet Titan primarily. Veil of Summer against other counterspell decks. Obviously you're playing 80 cards, so you're Yorion deck. You have Dovin's Veto against combo. This deck can literally do it all, but it's still a little bit soft in the early game. So, if it has a clunky hand or mulligan to like 5, sometimes you can get under it with decks like Burn or Humans or, these different aggressive decks, you can kind of get under them a little bit. But, once this deck is in the mid game, if it gets to set up its mana, and Blood Moon's kind of its other weakness. Once it gets to set up its mana, it's a devastating deck. So that's my pick for number 1 here at the beginning of April. That's it. let me know down in the comments if you like this kind of content, what your number one deck would be in the format, or what deck I may have missed on this list. So, this has been John for MTG Nexus. Hope to see you in the next video.